If you are looking for any reason to not start with Teddy in the beginning of this season, just take a look at that image and reevaluate your life choices. Hey guys, what is going on? Welcome back to another video from A Man Talks NRL SuperCoach, and in today's video we're going through the final player position guide as we talk through the best fullbacks to be selecting in your SuperCoach teams. Let's get into it. In my opinion, the fullback position is a place where you really want to be going for two guns, given that they've got the highest upside of any player in the game. That makes them naturally great vice-captain or captaincy shouts. So they're really, really important, I think, to be nailing the right fullback choice. So we'll start off with my man, James Tedesco. You're going to have to fork out a lot of money if you want to get him in your team to start the season. $840,000, absolutely ridiculous. But as you can see, 27% of the players in the game, don't mind paying that much. I'm one of them too. Just look at that average and you can see why, you're going to have to spend the big bucks to go with Teddy. Averaging 95, it wasn't even just like he played like a handful of games. This was across an entire season. It was legitimate 95 average. Just absolutely ridiculous. And to be honest, I don't even know how he's going to reduce that. I think there's potential for him to match that this season as well. So as you can see with Teddy, his statistics are just unreal. He was averaging about 35 points a game on just base stats. He typically runs over about 200 meters a game, for fun, I'd say. And his work rate is just similar to, say, the likes of Tuivasa-Sheck among the gun category of fullbacks. And his tackle breaking ability is just ridiculous. It seems as though every single run he'll make, he just breaks at least one or two tackles, and he's got a good offload in him as well, which really does help boost the SuperCoach points. And he's so integral to the way that the Roosters attack. He links up on both sides of the field. He'll typically always be the throws that final ball to either the center or the winger to crash over for a try. And for us, that just means try assist, line break assist, so he just gets points in so many different ways. As you can see, his scoring actually was not that much compared to, say, the likes of, even Brimson. I'm just looking at the numbers there. And I think he only scored 7 or 8 tries in the regular season, which, to be honest, I don't think that's actually that many for someone like Teddy. I think he typically seemed to bunch his tries. If he did score, he'd always be getting at least a double or a hat-trick. That's how he got those monster 199, 176 points in the previous season. And the Roosters, I think, tail off towards the end of last season, and I think a lot of that was just due to general fatigue. They were trying to go for 3 in a row, which I think is just, in any sport, it's always tough to go back to back. So I think they really faded towards the end of the last season. So I think they would have been rejuvenated by that, in my opinion. And I think they're really going to come out strong this year and really hope to have a solid season. They've still got the roster, I think, to be obviously in a top 4 contention. And Teddy is just going to be a linchpin to that. So in terms of actually selecting him into your SuperCoach side, for me, there's just some massive fear factor, I think, not going with Teddy to begin the season. Yes, he is super expensive, but I think you're paying for what you get. And the Roosters do have a pretty favourable start to the season. They're versing the Sea Eagles, the Tigers, the Rabbitohs, the Warriors and the Sharks and Storm in their first 6 games. So yes, the Rabbitohs and the Storm are tough games in rounds 3 and 6, but I think all those other 4 games are very winnable for the Roosters. All games that I can see the Roosters scoring a lot of points. If the Roosters are scoring points, I would expect Teddy to be involved in almost all of that, So I think he could typically, I could easily see him averaging over those first 6 games close to 80 plus, And you might say, obviously, if I think he's only going to be averaging 80, that's less than what he's priced at, so you'd expect him to go down in price. But the thing that I don't want to be, banking on is, is hoping that he just doesn't perform in those easy games and, it scores below his average so that he can go down for me in price so that I can pick him up later. We saw he could have a break even of 150 and he can just go out and score 170 and then that break even doesn't matter anymore, So I think having that notion of trying to pick him up at a cheaper price is not a bad way to think about it. But for me, someone like Teddy, if you get him into your team, he's a set and forget option. There is obviously a downside that he will be involved in Origin, so he'll be missing some games during the season, and the Roosters typically do like to rest their Origin players. But I think when you can have that massive upside of him and that captaincy potential with Teddy, for me, I think obviously I don't really have to say too much more. Absolute SuperCoach gun. I think it really comes down to whether you're willing to fork out that kind of money to begin the season, because you can do so much when you don't have that money sitting in just one player, I think. So if you really want to have a nice balanced squad, then you can go without Teddy. But for me, I want to chase the upside. I want to know I've got a set and forget captain option every week. So for me, Teddy is going to be in my team. Moving on, we've got AJ Brimson from the Titans. So I've got a really fond affection for Brimson. I brought him in towards the back end of last season when I think he was just returning from his injury. He just went on an absolute tear. He averaged 74 points, and that included an 18-point game in his first game back from injury. He was consistently breaking tackles, scoring a lot of tries. As you can see from there, his evasive statistics were pretty good, almost on par with Teddy. I think he scored the same amount of tries as Tedesco did in just his 8 or 9 games towards the back end of the season, compared to Teddy, who played almost all of the regular season. So I think Brimson offers a nice pod option, given that he's currently only owned by about 6% of the game, and the Titans do have a really nice start to the season where they verse the Warriors, Broncos and Cowboys in their first 3 games. So I think that's all games that they can score a lot of points, and Brimson obviously could be involved in a lot of their attacking plays. And then they got the Raiders, Knights and Sea Eagles. So really the Raiders are the only tough game, I'd say, in that first 6 game stretch. 5 of those games, I think you can expect the Titans to be potentially scoring a lot of points, and I can see Brimson, getting back to that 70-point average again. The only downside is that it was a very small kind of sample size that we saw him perform so well. It's whether or not we think that he can actually do that over the long term. But for me, I think he's a fine pod to go with. So I think AJ Brimson is someone I'm really keen on as well. Maybe picking him up later in the season if he does go down in price. But yeah, can't discourage him if someone's looking to go for a pod fullback to start the season. Next, we've got Ryan Papenhuyzen. So Teddy and Pappy, I really expect to be the kind of top 2 most popular fullback choices coming into the season. And I think we saw obviously in the trials that Papenhuyzen was goal kicking for the Storm, which is kind of what I expected, which really then does add a nice string to his bow in terms of his scoring potential. He's got a really solid base floor of about 32 points a game. He's got decent tackle breaking ability, not quite to the level of say Teddy or Brimson, but I saw even in the trial game, similar to what all modern fullbacks do, they pop up on both sides of the field and they contribute to the kind of edge plays. So I think he'll be able to contribute to a lot of their attacking plays, and obviously the Storm are a quality side, even despite their draw, which isn't the easiest to begin the season. They've got the Rabbitohs, Eel and Panthers all in the first 3 games, but the difference was they're the Storm, they're the best team in the competition, and they've been so for years, right? So, and they do also have easy games following that in terms of the Bulldogs and the Broncos. So potential ploy could be, if you wanted to say not start with him beginning of the season, hope that he goes less than what his priced at, and then he can go down in price by round 3, and then you can pick him up cheaper in round 4 before they go on that 2 easy game stretch against the Broncos and Bulldogs, because they do then follow those 2 other games with the Roosters. So not the easiest overall draw for the Storm. I think Papenhuyzen though is pretty safe, reliable option. He did start last season a little bit slow, but I think we all have to keep in mind that it was basically his first full season in the NRL, and he's still pretty young. I think he's 22 years old. And then he really, performed exceedingly well in the second half of the year. I think he scored 4 games over 100 plus points, which really shows his kind of, he's got that capability to go big in games. And so I think that really makes him an appealing option if you want to go for, say, pod captaincy options every now and then. I would expect him to be again involved in the Origin setup for New South Wales, which does kind of mean he'll miss some games. But I think, really, really safe option to have in your second kind of fullback spot alongside Teddy. I think that's the option that I'm leaning towards myself. And I think given that he does have that goal kicking, it then potentially does boost his average points up a little bit more. So while he is expensive, I think there still could be value, given that he could maybe potentially add 5 to 10 points a game purely just from the goal kicking. So Papenhuyzen, can't discourage him, great fullback option to have as well. Next we'll move on to Clint Gutherson. So Gutho is actually really interesting option. I think he's only owned by about 4% of the game at the time that I put this together, so he's definitely a good pod option, and the Eels do have really good games to begin the season. They've got the Broncos, Storm, tough, but then the Sharks, Tigers, Dragons and Raiders. So 4 out of those 6 games are pretty easy, and I'd expect the Eels to do well in those. Obviously the first game against the Broncos is a good matchup and they can score a lot of points, and he actually did very well against the Broncos in the 2 times that they played last season. He scored 124 points and 114 points. Not bad. So if you're looking for a start of your season off with a bang, but potentially a pod captain option, why not go with Gutho? The thing with Gutho I think to keep in mind is that I think his average is definitely inflated with the period when Mitchell Moses was out of the Eel side, because then he really took over in terms of the main creative force in the Eels squad, and he also took up the goal kicking while Mitchell Moses was out of the side. In the 4 games that Mitchell Moses wasn't playing for the Eels, Gutherson averaged 101 points, but when Mitchell Moses was playing, his average was 60. So just looking at that, I think with the presence of Mitchell Moses, that does impact Gutherson's performance and SuperCoach output. And obviously Mitchell Moses is fully healthy and he's going to be expecting to play. It's like, for that reason alone, I think I'm not going to go with Gutherson. Obviously, I think if it came to a situation where Mitchell Moses was out of the team, I think then Gutherson obviously becomes a great option, given he's got that goal kicking and he takes on more of that creative playmaking role. But I think while Moses is in the team, it really does I think those numbers do tell a bit of a false narrative with him in terms of what he could actually average. Like as you can see there, his creative numbers were really high, but I think a lot of that came kind of bunched together in those games without Moses. But, overall, I think he's still a good option, but just given that presence of Moses, I think that really does kind of turn me off Gutherson, so I don't think he's going to be one that I'll be going with to begin the season. So Dylan Edwards I've got here. Given that the Panthers have a really good opening draw, I thought it'd be worthwhile to include him here, given that, you'd expect, as the Panthers scoring a lot of points in their easy draw to begin the season, the fullback Edwards would really be involved in that as well. He's definitely a pod option. He's only owned by about 1% of the game at the time that I put this together. He's got really good base stats, averaging about 33 points a game in just base alone. The thing with him though is that he just doesn't have that kind of creative factor that a lot of the other gun fullbacks have. Given the presence of, say, Cleary and Luai, I think they're obviously clearly the two primary creative playmakers in the Panther squad. And I think Edwards doesn't really have to take up that mantle as much as, say, the likes of Tedesco or Gutherson or even Papenhuyzen to an extent. So I think that really does impact his upside. And in last season, he only scored once over 100 points when he got 126. His next highest after that was 75. So I think he's going to be a real kind of consistent option between the 60 to 70 mark maybe, but he's not going to be that big upside gun fullback, say, to Tedesco and Papenhuyzen, who can easily crack 100 points with ease. So I think because of that factor, I don't think I'll be going with Edwards. If you want to go with the pod option, given that the Panthers have that good draw, I can't really argue it out of him, but I don't think I'll be going there personally, just given that I don't think he's got that upside to some of the other gun fullbacks. And I think when you're going with gun fullbacks, the upside is a massive factor that you want to be taking into account when choosing them. So for that reason, I don't think I'll be going with Edwards to begin the season. So moving on to Latrell Mitchell. Latrell is someone I'm just so kind of divided on when it comes to SuperCoach. He's absolutely burnt me last year when I picked him up. I think I brought him in the round that he scored 9 points. So he's definitely got that in him. But then, a few weeks later, I'm pretty sure he scored like 140, So he's got that real inconsistency. But I think given how we saw him play in the Charity Shield match, he looked really involved. He obviously set up a few tries, scored a try of his own. I think last year was a bit of a down year for him, given that he obviously had those injuries set him back at times. Just the year prior in 2019, he averaged 70 points a game. I think he's definitely priced actually fairly well at 525k, given that we know what he can do in terms of SuperCoach points. And he did obviously have those massive games towards the back end of last season where he scored 141. So he's obviously got that upside in him as well. The only negative, I guess, with picking Latrell is that the Rabbitohs do obviously have like a lot of good backline players who potentially could then take away points from him. Obviously the likes of, say, Cody Walker, Adam Reynolds, so he's not the chief kind of creative force for the Rabbitohs, but he obviously is a very, very important part of that. And like as you can see, he's averaging about 28 points a game last season in terms of creative statistics, which really does show his influence. So I guess while there are other good players at the Rabbitohs backline who could take the shine off him, he really is an important part of that, in part of their attack. So I could fully expect that kind of creative numbers to be the same this year. He just doesn't have the base statistics, which introduces that kind of inconsistency in terms of his scores. He's only averaging about 17 points a game in base. He just doesn't match up to the likes of, say, Teddy, Tuivasa-Sheck, or even Edwards, So I think I obviously like the upside, but I do want to have some kind of consistent floor so I don't get those like stinker 9 or 10 point games from him. That kind of inconsistency does put me off, but he is at a decent price. 525k for Latrell when he could potentially go off and average 70 this year. He obviously does offer then great value, and he's definitely kind of a pod option at fullback. He's only owned by about 6% of the game. Him losing that centre eligibility really does hurt though, because I think if he was still a fullback centre duel like he was last season, I think he would then become a really, really solid option to put in your centre. But fullback is a really stacked position, and I just don't know for myself if I can find this space for him when I myself rate the likes of Tedesco, Papenhuyzen or Brimson ahead of him. So for that reason, I don't think I'll be starting with Latrell in my team to begin the season. But, I can't talk anyone out of getting Latrell, because I actually do think he offers good value this season. You just have to kind of mentally prepare yourself for some low games, but, enjoy those massive upside games when he does get them, because he will bring them, I think, at some points during the season. And finally, we move on to Tuivasa-Sheck. So Tuivasa-Sheck is kind of an interesting option for me as well. He's priced at about 520k, and he's got really, really good base statistics. 35 points a game in base. It's only matched by Teddy in this gun fullback category. But he just doesn't have like the kind of creative or evasive statistics of some of these other guys, which is, to me, is actually quite strange, because when you think of Tuivasa-Sheck, you think of his amazing running ability and tackle breaking ability, but just looking at the numbers, he just didn't really seem to be getting those to, say, the levels of, say, Brimson or Tedesco, and he really didn't offer that much in terms of creativity when it came to the Warriors side. So I feel like last year was a bit of a down year for Tuivasa-Sheck, because I think he obviously is a gun player in real life. We have obviously seen him average in the 70s, which is what he did in 2019. Potentially, I don't know if that was an outlier year, because in the other years around that, so say in 2017 and 18, he averaged 60 and 57, and then 59 obviously in 2020. So potentially you could see that 2019 year as an outlier, and he could actually just be a guy who averages around the high 50s, low 60 mark, which is obviously not bad for fullback. But in terms of SuperCoach, we're always going to be looking for those massive 80 plus point averaging fullbacks like Ponga, Tedesco, Trbojevic when he's healthy. So I think while he is cheaper and obviously could offer some good value, just don't think he's got quite that upside as some of the other fullbacks that I mentioned before. Last season, he only had one game where he scored over 100 points, where he scored 123 against the Knights. But his next highest after that was 89, so he didn't even crack the 90-point game outside of that 120-pointer. So I think he just doesn't really seem to offer that much upside. And while I rate him as a player, I just don't think he's going to be super relevant for SuperCoach. Obviously, he's decently owned by about 9%, probably given his price tag. But for me personally, I don't think I'm going to be going there to start the season. I feel like I'm pretty locked into Teddy and Papenhuyzen. Potentially Latrell, or some Rabbitohs fan, can talk me into that as well. But yeah, Tuivasa-Sheck, great player in real life. And I could potentially see him average about the same as what he did last season. He did only score, I think, 3 tries in the regular season last year, which he obviously could then increase. Which maybe then gets his average up to, say, 65. So he could potentially make a little bit of money. But personally, when I don't see him getting that much upside, I don't think I'm going to be going there at the start of the season. He could be a player I just kind of keep an eye on as the season progresses. If I think that he's performing really well, I'll get him into my team then. So next up, I've got kind of like the rest of the fullbacks. So the way that I've kind of thought about it is that, like, for me, I think fullback is a position where you really want to be targeting 2 guns. So I think there's not really much room to be having like a cheap fullback occupy one of those really valuable spots. So I've kind of just put together a bit of a mix of some mid-range and mainly some cheap options as well. So I'll quickly touch on Alex Johnston, given that I saw that he's owned by about 7% of the game. So me personally, I just don't think I'm going to be going with Johnston, or would I recommend him putting in your fullback position. You can obviously put him in your centre, if you really want to get him into your team, so he doesn't have to be occupying a fullback spot. I just think his base is not that great at 19 points a game, and he is really heavily dependent on scoring tries, to get his points in SuperCoach. Obviously, he does score a lot of tries. He's been one of the leading try scorers in the NRL for years now. And the Rabbitohs are a really red-hot side at the moment. They showed us at the back end of last year, and even in the Charity Shield game, they're really genuine contenders for the premiership this season. So I'd expect Johnston to be getting a lot of tries, But I think, given the nature of how he has to get his points from scoring a lot of tries, that does bring in some inconsistency as well. Spending close to 500k for a fullback who's maybe going to get us 40 points a game, just don't see the value in that, Obviously, he can go off and get 2 or 3 tries in a game, no problem, but it's sometimes hard to call that, And I think the Rabbitohs don't have a great start to the season, where they versus the Storm and the Roosters in their first 3 games. So someone like Johnston, I think, if you really want to be taking like a punt on him, I would just look at the Rabbitohs draw and see when they've got an easy game stretch coming up, and that's when hopefully maybe he's gone down in price or something like that, and you could then pick him up and hope that he then goes on a try scoring run and you gain all the points. But in terms of putting him into your fullback spot, I can't really recommend it. Now, the rest of the other guys, Charlie Staines, Moylan, Texoy, Tessinu, and Dan Laurie, I'm not going to really talk about them too much because I've covered them all in previous videos. Staines, Tessinu, and Dan Laurie I all talked about in my previous video on centres, and Moylan and Texoy I talked about in my 5A videos. So if you haven't seen those already and you want to see my thoughts on them, definitely go check those ones out. The reason I put them here is that they all are eligible to play in fullback, but as I mentioned, I wouldn't be advising to put a cheap player in your fullback spot. I think it's really important to be getting 2-gun fullbacks, and so yeah, can't really recommend to have them in your fullback spot. But if you want to hear my thoughts on them, do go check out those other videos. And finally, I've got some kind of ones to watch. So obviously Ponga and Trbojevic are both out injured at the moment. I think Ponga is expected to come by the earliest around round 3 or 4, and Trbojevic around the same time as well. Now, we obviously know the pedigree that these guys bring. Ponga was averaging 80 points a game last season and was an absolute monster. So really like having Ponga in my team. It's a shame that we're not going to be able to have him to begin the season. He does score his points in a variety of ways because he did have the goal kicking up until Lino took over at some points, because to be honest, Ponga's goal kicking record is not amazing, but okay-ish base, really good tackle breaking ability. He's obviously really important to their attacking players, so popping up on either side of the field, and he did have that goal kicking. Whether or not he still has that remains to be seen, but just all of those factors really made Ponga a great option, and I think the Knights still do have a really good 6-game stretch to begin the season. So say if he does come back in round 3 or 4, you potentially could jump on him early before say others kind of wait for his price drop. I would personally advise maybe waiting and seeing how he comes back from his injury. I don't think he'll be hurt too much, given that he's going to be very, very low owned. So you're not going to be kind of missing out with the crowd picking up Ponga. So you can give yourself 1 to 2 weeks to see how he performs before maybe picking him up. Similar approach, I think, with Trbojevic. The one thing with Trbojevic, though, is obviously given his injury history, it is a harder argument to say pick him up as soon as he comes back, because we just don't quite know how his body's going to hold up when he comes back to playing. That's kind of me. I'm a little bit more conservative, I think, and I really don't want to be spending around 600k for him to potentially not be performing up to his best. So obviously Trbojevic was super popular before his injury. That 7% is probably just players who just haven't yet changed their teams after finding out that he's been injured. Again, one to watch. I would say watch for longer than say watch Ponga come back from his injury, just given the recurring nature of his hamstring problems. But obviously Trbojevic, you can't really argue. We know what he can do. Regularly cracks out 100 points. But yeah, definitely one to watch. And I think I would err on the side of caution, I think, when waiting for Tommy Turbo. And finally, I've got Corey Allen here at 545k. So I watched the highlights of the Bulldogs trial match, and it was encouraging to see him kind of popping up on both sides of the field, kind of being that player that makes the final pass to the outside backs, which really then kind of it lends itself well to getting creative statistics, if he's able to get try assists and line break assists in that way. And he was decent getting that last season, getting about 17 points a game. Obviously, all these statistics are for him playing for the Rabbitohs side. And, we all know towards the back end of last season, the Rabbitohs just went on an absolute tear, scoring bucket-loads of points. He obviously benefited a lot from that. So I think Corey Allen, I'm definitely not going to be picking him up, I think, to begin the season. The Bulldogs don't really have a good start to the season. They versed the Knights, Panthers, Broncos, Rabbitohs, and Storm in their first 5 games. That's 3 teams from the top 6 of last season, and the Bulldogs, obviously they've made some new additions like himself, Nick Kotrick, Carl Flanagan. There were some encouraging signs as well in the trial match, I'll give them that. But I think definitely a wait and see approach with Corey Allen, see how the Bulldogs kind of perform and how himself performs, because I think 545k is pretty expensive for him. Paying that much for someone in the Bulldogs backline, I think is quite a lot of money, given that we saw that they weren't really performing that well as a side overall last season. But yeah, definitely someone to keep an eye on, and I think if he puts in some good performances, he could be a nice kind of pod option at some point during the season. Alright guys, we made it to the end of the video. That's my kind of thoughts overall on the fullback position. You can probably see that there's one clear standout in my head, but I think hopefully I've been able to present some good arguments for each of the fullback options and potentially some pod options. So yeah, really hope you guys found some value out of that one. If you did, please drop a like and a thumbs up on the video. Would really appreciate it, and would really appreciate a subscribe as well if you haven't done so already, given that I'll be continuing to put out videos throughout the season as well. But until then, I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks.